I sat at the kitchen table, the early morning light filtering through the gauzy curtains, casting long shadows across the worn wood surface. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Lucy's absence was tangible, a hole in the rhythm of our lives even after a year of her moving out. I stirred my coffee absently, the spoon scraping faintly against the ceramic, and wondered how it had all come to this. Lucy, my eldest, had always been a force of nature. Tall, confident, beautiful, and ambitious, she had a way of bending the world to her will. I envied her that. She had everything I never did. A man who adored her, wealth at her fingertips, and the ease of someone who had never known the kind of compromises life had demanded of me. Our relationship had always been fraught, but it wasn't always this way. I loved Lucy with every fiber of my being, but somewhere along the way the bond we shared had frayed. Perhaps it was when I saw how effortlessly she succeeded, while I toiled to keep a roof over our heads after my divorce. Or maybe it was when I realized how much she reminded me of myself. Not the woman I was now, but the girl I used to be before life wore me down. Lucy had left our home last year after one too many arguments. She was tired of my criticism, as she called it, but she had no idea how hard it was to watch her live the kind of life I could only dream of. Her boyfriend, Mark, was the kind of man women dreamed about: devoted, successful, attentive. He was everything her father had never been. And though I knew it wasn't fair, I couldn't help but feel a sharp pang of resentment every time I thought about them. Now it was just me and Dan. My son, my rock. At 19 he was already taller than me, his broad shoulders and easy smile a constant reminder of his father's best traits. But where his father had been distant and preoccupied, Dan was present in a way that surprised me. He was warm, affectionate, and kind, qualities I hadn't realized how much I craved until I saw them in him. "Morning, Mom," Dan's voice broke through my thoughts. He stepped into the kitchen, his hair tousled from sleep, wearing a faded t-shirt and sweatpants. There was an ease to his movements, the kind of casual grace that came with youth. "Morning," I replied, setting my coffee down as he grabbed a bowl and poured himself some cereal. He sat across from me, his gaze meeting mine, and I felt the familiar warmth of his presence fill the room. "How'd you sleep?" he asked, his tone genuine. "Fine," I said, though it was a lie. My nights were restless, filled with half-formed dreams and a gnawing loneliness that seemed to grow with each passing year. "What about you?" "Good," he said between bites. "I was thinking we could watch a movie later if you're up for it." I smiled, grateful for the suggestion. "That sounds nice." Dan had a way of making me feel seen in a way no one else did. He noticed when I was having a bad day, offering to help with chores or bringing me tea without being asked. He listened when I talked, his attention undivided, as though my words truly mattered. It was a stark contrast to his father, who had spent most of our marriage buried in work or lost in his own world. As I watched Dan, a flicker of guilt stirred in me. I knew I leaned on him too much, that I looked to him for the kind of support a mother shouldn't need from her son. But I couldn't help it. He was my anchor, my lifeline, and the only man in my life who made me feel like I mattered. "You're quiet this morning," Dan said, tilting his head slightly as he studied me. "Just thinking," I replied, forcing a smile. "Lucy called yesterday." "Oh." His tone was carefully neutral, but I saw the flash of irritation in his eyes. He and Lucy had never been particularly close, their sibling bond strained by the same undercurrent that colored my relationship with her. "How is she?" "Fine," I said, though I hadn't asked much about her. Our conversations were brief and perfunctory these days, a far cry from the long, heartfelt talks we used to have. She mentioned she and Mark are going on a trip to Italy. Dan snorted softly. "Must be nice." I nodded, unable to disagree. It must be nice to live a life so free of worry, to have someone who adored you enough to whisk you away to another country just because. It was the kind of love I had always dreamed of but never known. My marriage to their father had been practical, a partnership built on necessity rather than passion. And while I had loved him in my own way, I had always felt like something was missing. Dan reached across the table and squeezed my hand, pulling me from my thoughts. "You okay, Mom?" I nodded, my throat tightening. "I'm fine. Just tired." He didn't press, his hand lingering on mine for a moment longer before he pulled away. It was such a small gesture, but it filled the hollow ache in my chest in a way nothing else could. I wondered, not for the first time, what my life would look like without him here. Dan was the glue that held me together, the only bright spot in the dim landscape of my days. And though I knew it wasn't fair, I clung to him like a lifeline, afraid of what would happen if I let go. The house was still when I returned home, the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway echoing against the quiet. I fumbled with my keys, the effects of the wine clouding my thoughts as I leaned heavily against the doorframe. The night had been a swirl of emotions, laughter mingling with wistful confessions to my friend about my loneliness, my envy of Lucy's perfect life, and the dull ache of an unfulfilled heart. The wine had dulled the edges of those feelings, but they still lingered beneath the surface like shadows. "Mom, you okay?" Dan's voice startled me as I turned to shut the door. He stood at the top of the stairs, his hair mussed from sleep and his eyes filled with concern. "I'm fine," I murmured, waving him off, but my balance faltered as I tried to step out of my shoes. Dan was by my side in an instant, his arm steadying me as I swayed. "Come on, let me help you." I protested weakly, but the truth was I needed his support. The world felt slightly tilted, and Dan's solid presence was grounding. He guided me up the stairs, his grip firm but gentle, and into my bedroom. "Lie down," he said, pulling back the covers and helping me ease onto the bed. His voice was soft, patient, but there was a seriousness in his expression that made my heart ache. "You're a good boy, Dan," I said as I sank into the pillows, my words slurring slightly. "You're the best thing in my life, you know that?" He didn't respond right away, but the look he gave me was full of something I couldn't quite name. Tenderness, maybe, or a kind of quiet determination. "Good night, Mom," he said finally, brushing a stray strand of hair from my forehead before turning off the light and closing the door behind him. I fell asleep almost instantly, the warmth of his presence lingering even as the darkness enveloped me. The smell of coffee and something warm and buttery pulled me from sleep the next morning. I stretched, my head pounding slightly, but the memory of Dan's care the night before bringing a small smile to my lips. I didn't deserve him, not his kindness, not his attention, but I clung to it all the same. When I came downstairs, I found him in the kitchen, humming softly as he flipped pancakes on the stove. A bouquet of fresh flowers, a simple arrangement of daisies and wildflowers, sat in a vase on the table. "Morning, Mom," he said, glancing over his shoulder with a grin. "Breakfast is almost ready." "You didn't have to do all this," I said, touched and a little embarrassed as I slid into a chair. "I wanted to," he replied, setting a plate in front of me. The pancakes were golden and perfect, topped with a drizzle of syrup and a few slices of fresh fruit. "I figured you could use a little pampering after last night." I laughed softly, though there was a lump forming in my throat. "You spoil me, Dan. You really do." He shrugged, taking the seat across from me and digging into his own plate. "You deserve it." We ate in comfortable silence, the morning light streaming through the window and casting a soft glow over the kitchen. Felt peaceful. Right. Over the next few weeks, Dan seemed to go out of his way to make life easier for me. He took on more chores around the house, always with a smile and a joke to lighten the mood. He noticed when I was feeling down, offering quiet words of encouragement or simply sitting with me until the heaviness passed. And every now and then he'd surprise me with little gestures. A bouquet of flowers, my favorite tea, or a new book he thought I'd like. "Why are you doing all this?" I asked one evening as we sat on the couch, the TV playing quietly in the background. "Because I want you to be happy," he said simply, his eyes meeting mine with a sincerity that took my breath away. "You've done so much for me, Mom. I just want to give a little back." I didn't know what to say. No one had ever cared for me the way Dan did. Not his father, not anyone. It filled a part of me I hadn't realized was empty. And though I knew it wasn't fair to lean on him so heavily, I couldn't bring myself to pull away. One day, Dan came home with a look of excitement on his face. "I got a job," he announced, holding up a pair of heavy work boots. "A job?" I asked, surprised. "Where?" "At a construction site," he said, his grin widening. "It's not glamorous, but it pays well. I figured it's time I started contributing more around here. And," he hesitated, his cheeks flushing slightly, "I want to be able to buy you nice things." Flowers, gifts. To make you feel special. My heart swelled, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. Oh, Dan, I whispered, pulling him into a hug. You don't have to do that. You already make me feel special just by being you. I want to, he said firmly, his arms tightening around me. You've done so much for me, Mom. It's my turn to take care of you. In that moment, I felt a warmth I hadn't known in years. A sense of being cherished, of being seen. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly happy. The days with Dan began to blur into something I hadn't anticipated. An ease that bordered on intimacy. He was thoughtful in ways I hadn't experienced in years, noticing the small details of my life, like how I preferred my coffee or the music I played on quiet afternoons. It wasn't just the gestures, though. It was the feeling of being seen, truly seen after so long. One afternoon, Dan appeared in the doorway with a smile and a box wrapped in deep blue paper. "This is for you," he said, holding it out. I raised an eyebrow. "What's the occasion? Does there need to be one?" His tone was teasing, but his expression was sincere. Inside the box was a simple yet elegant necklace. A delicate chain with a tiny sapphire pendant that seemed to catch the light just so. My breath caught. "It's beautiful, Dan," I whispered, running my fingers over the cool metal. "I'm glad you like it," he said, his gaze soft. "It reminded me of you." From that moment, our closeness grew in ways neither of us seemed to acknowledge aloud. He started bringing me little gifts. Books he thought I'd enjoy, flowers for no reason, even a dress he insisted would look perfect on me. When he suggested we go out to dinner, I hesitated at first, but his enthusiasm was infectious. "Just let me treat you," he urged, his smile boyish and disarming. "I promise it'll be fun." The dress he'd chosen was a deep emerald green, the fabric flowing and soft against my skin. When I stepped into the room wearing it, Dan's eyes widened. "Ellen," he murmured almost reverently. "You look stunning." The restaurant was intimate, the lighting warm and golden, casting a soft glow over everything. As we talked, I found myself laughing more than I had in months, maybe years. Dan had a way of pulling me out of my thoughts, making the world feel lighter. When we left the restaurant, the night air was cool, the city alive with the hum of distant traffic and the occasional burst of laughter from passing strangers. We walked side by side, our steps unhurried, as if neither of us wanted the evening to end. At one point, Dan stopped, gently catching my arm. "Wait," he said, his voice low. I turned to him, confused, but before I could ask what was wrong, he wrapped his arms around me. His embrace was warm, steady, grounding. "I'm really glad we did this," he said, his breath stirring the strands of my hair. "So am I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. And then, without warning, he kissed me. It was soft at first, tentative, as if he was giving me the chance to pull away. But I didn't. I leaned into him, letting the world around us fade into the background. When we broke apart, his hand brushed my cheek, his thumb tracing the curve of my jaw. "You're beautiful, Ellen," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I swear I'll spend the rest of my life making you happy." His words settled over me like a promise, one that I felt in my bones. For the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. When we returned home from the restaurant, the quiet of the house felt warm and inviting. I slipped off my shoes, savoring the coolness of the floor beneath my feet. Dan followed me inside, his jacket slung casually over one shoulder, his easy smile still lingering from the evening. "I don't want this night to end," I admitted, glancing back at him. "Then it doesn't have to," he replied simply, his voice steady, as if the suggestion were the most natural thing in the world. We settled in the living room, the soft light from a lamp casting gentle shadows across the room. The conversation that had begun over dinner continued seamlessly, stories, laughter, and the kind of shared moments that make time irrelevant. Dan talked about his childhood and ambitions, his words revealing layers of himself that I hadn't seen before. In turn, I found myself sharing pieces of my life I hadn't spoken about in years. As the hours passed, I felt a lightness within me, a quiet joy I hadn't realized I'd been missing. At one point, Dan leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "You've been on your feet all day," he said, glancing down at my bare feet. "Let me take care of you for once." Before I could respond, he disappeared into the bathroom. I heard the sound of running water and the gentle clinking of glass jars. When he returned, he had a small towel draped over one arm and a bottle of lotion in his hand. "Sit back," he said, his tone warm but firm. "This is non-negotiable." I laughed, shaking my head, but relented. As he knelt in front of me, his hands worked gently, his touch careful and soothing. My initial protests faded, replaced by a contented sigh. "You're too good at this," I teased, and he smiled up at me, his expression playful but kind. After finishing, he stood and gestured toward the bathroom. "Your bath is ready," he said. "Take your time." Touched by his thoughtfulness, I thanked him and stepped into the bathroom. The warm, lavender-scented water was inviting, the steam curling in soft tendrils around me. As I sank into the tub, I let the day's weight slip away, my thoughts quiet and content. When I emerged, wrapped in a soft robe, Dan was waiting for me in the living room. He looked up from the book he had been thumbing through, his smile easy and familiar. Something in me stirred, a quiet certainty that I couldn't explain. Without overthinking, I walked over to him and leaned down, kissing him gently. It was a simple act, but one that carried all the words I didn't know how to say. When I pulled back, he smiled, his hand brushing a strand of damp hair from my face. "You make me happy, Ellen," he said softly, his voice steady. "You make me feel alive," I replied, my words filled with sincerity. In the weeks that followed, the quiet joy between us grew. Dan's presence brought a lightness to my days, a warmth that felt like a new beginning. We shared laughter, quiet moments, and the kind of companionship that felt effortless. Despite the changes I felt within me, we decided to keep our relationship private, a sanctuary just for us. I felt no need for grand declarations. The bond we shared was ours alone. The newfound joy in my life began to ripple outward. My relationship with my daughter slowly began to mend. Conversations that were once clipped and tense grew longer, warmer, filled with laughter that had been missing for years. Dan and I cherished the moments we spent together, whether it was a simple walk in the park or sharing quiet evenings at home. In his presence, I rediscovered parts of myself I thought were long gone. A vibrancy, a sense of hope, and the feeling of being truly seen and valued. Though our love remained a quiet secret, it was enough. In Dan, I had found something I hadn't known I was searching for. A connection that filled my heart and made me believe in new beginnings. For the first time in years, I felt like the woman I had once dreamed I could be, happy, joyful, and alive.